Dinosaurs are often considered a gateway drug to science, and for good reason. At the most basic level, it's hard not to feel at least a little bit of wonder to imagine a long-gone world populated with animals the size of buildings, with fascinating features unlike anything around today. From the casual enthusiasts to the professional bone diggers, everyone with even a passing interest in the topic of prehistoric life probably has one particular piece of media that they hold near and dear. They say you never forget your first, and as far as dinosaurs and I are concerned, the subject of today's video lives in a very special place in my memory. Now, this isn't really based on any proper poll, but I will say that from my perusing on social media over the last few years, it seems that, Jurassic Park aside of course, most people credit the BBC's 1999 miniseries Walking with Dinosaurs for getting them hooked on prehistory, and I respect it. It was a well-crafted, genre-defining program, pretty much the first piece of film or TV that portrayed its subjects as living, breathing animals in a nature documentary format, using practical effects and CGI to bring these creatures to life in a way that hadn't been done outside the Jurassic Park movies. Between the arguably iconic creature design, visual effects that largely still hold up to this day, well-chosen shooting locations with beautiful scenery, and almost Shakespearean narration from Kenneth Branagh, underpinned by a majestic score, Walking with Dinosaurs is a bona fide classic that deserves its accolades. That said, I don't actually have a lot of strong feelings for it. My exposure to the series was pretty diffuse and stretched out over nearly a decade in the form of this book and a few computer games of varying levels of obscurity, plus the ghost memory of seeing the Avery Brooks narrated American version once.
Reptiles ruled, and dinosaurs walked the earth.
By the time I actually watched the show proper sometime in the mid to late 2000s, it just didn't quite have the oomph of novelty for me to really write home about it. While others were walking with dinosaurs, I was wearing down my parents' patience, and the VHS tape they recorded it on for me, with the 2001 documentary When Dinosaurs Roamed America. This Discovery Channel program is probably the most understated of the big-name dino docs of its generation, and arguably the most maligned as well, given its unfortunate fate for somehow having its footage and production assets used in a variety of garbage, including later Discovery-made shows. And while it isn't unpopular, if only because of the small pool of shows in this genre, I don't think it gets the love it deserves, and I doubt there will be many retrospective reviews for its 20th anniversary in the way its British predecessor got a few years back for its big 2-0 milestone. In that spirit, I invite you on a trip down my memory lane as I revisit When Dinosaurs Roamed America, and reflect on what this show got right and wrong with 2 decades of hindsight, as well as discussing its overall successes and shortcomings as a documentary, and indulging in some early childhood nostalgia. This was originally meant to be one long video, but the amount of information I wanted to cover, plus life not really caring about my YouTube plans, made me decide that it would be better to just split it into a multi-part miniseries if I wanted to still have something released today. So this particular video will just be a general overview of the show, and take a look at one of its lesser known aspects. With all that said, let's begin. If you don't know or remember, When Dinosaurs Roamed America is a 90-minute film that takes viewers on a journey across the continental United States to explore 5 different points and places of the Mesozoic era, starting in the Northeast with the late Triassic of New York and early Jurassic Pennsylvania, before heading out west to late Jurassic Utah, mid-Cretaceous New Mexico, and finishing off in late Cretaceous South Dakota at the very end of the dinosaur's reign. The reason for the America-centric focus was a combination of audience appeal and scientific novelty, with a touch of rosy pre-9/11 patriotism. Many of the most famous species and best-studied fossil formations were in fact found in the States, so it makes sense to want to show them off. Though the program does a good job at balancing between the big names and the then new or seldom seen species and ecosystems that in many cases haven't had an on-screen presence in the last 2 decades since its original airing. Despite what you might imagine given some of the bombastic, star-spangled connotations that America can invoke, the documentary is overall surprisingly laid back and intimate in its presentation. The decision to use individual states as locational framing devices gives a very localized feel for each segment, and the cinematography and warm color palette brings a lush but grounded look to many of the shots that adds to the idea that we're watching a series of flashbacks to the past whenever the show occasionally brings up what would otherwise be an immersion-breaking element, like brief X-ray cutaways to the animals' anatomies and short minute-long segments featuring paleontologists describing aspects of what was just shown. Narrator John Goodman, more on him later, has a great voice and brings a very earnest, almost folksy feel to the show in its script, written by Jorgen Kane, and the score is among the warmest and most atmospheric that I've ever heard in any nature documentary. Composed by Christopher Frank, most famously of the electronic group Tangerine Dream, the music strikes a perfect balance between staying out of the way enough to avoid being overbearing, while still adding to the soundscape and being memorable in its own right if you choose to listen closely. There's a few cues in here I particularly love, with some that feel like they were intentionally written to complement the show's Emmy Award-winning sound design, if not straight up inspired by a specific sound effect.
Felled by a broken leg, Apatosaurus is mortally wounded.
It's a shame that the full soundtrack was never officially released, and clean versions have generally been difficult to find. Shout out to Star Wars Jabaro for doing God's work here. Taken together, all this makes When Dinosaurs Roamed America a very relaxed and pleasing watch. I spent so many more days of my childhood than I can remember popping my recorded copy into the VHS player and watching this on repeat every weekend, definitely on a near daily basis during the summers. I even acted out the on-screen action with my own drawn or traced 2D cutout figurines. I actually kept them stored away in a phone book with laminate coverings. If I ever find them again, maybe it'll be a future video topic. Anyway, all of this is very much in spite of the fact that the story behind its production is the kind of thing that you'd call absolute chaos. Even though it does mildly annoy me to hear the show being pegged as just a quickly made ripoff of Walking with Dinosaurs, it's not exactly a secret that Discovery Channel saw the critical and commercial success that the BBC achieved in 1999 and wanted in on some of that millions-year-old money. The project was officially commissioned in early mid-2000, barely 6 months after the final episode of Walking with Dinosaurs aired in early November, with Pierre de L'Espinois of the now-defunct production company Evergreen Films tapped to direct and co-executive produce. De L'Espinois was already an established filmmaker at the time, and quite keen on exploring new ideas and utilizing the latest technologies. But he hadn't before been faced with a task as demanding as what Discovery was presenting him with. Walking with Dinosaurs took about 3 years and $10 million to produce roughly 3 hours of footage spread across 6 episodes, making it the most expensive TV documentary series ever made. Even holds a Guinness World Record for it. Discovery wanted a program as comprehensive and well-researched as its British predecessor, but squeezed into 90 minutes. They also wanted to feature on-location interviews with paleontologists to avoid the criticism Walking with Dinosaurs received for not making a clear distinction between hard facts and the more speculative aspects of its presentations. The studio also didn't like the often inconsistent look between the computer-generated models and the animatronics used in Walking with Dinosaurs, and instead opted for their own creatures to be entirely CGI. This meant that the models had to be more detailed and composited well enough to hold up in the close-up shots against the brand new HD digital camera technology. Oh, and they wanted all this done within a year to coincide with the release date of Jurassic Park 3, which had recently been shifted back to July 18, 2001. All on a comparatively shoestring budget of about $5 million. Because of the extremely tight production schedule, De L'Espinois and Evergreen Films ended up having to juggle pretty much all aspects of the show concurrently. To ensure that they had regular behind-the-scenes input from paleontologists and other relevant scientists to figure out things like what prehistoric ecosystems they'd feature, how the animals would look and move, who was living with who, and finding real-world locations that best matched each prehistoric environment, a website was set up with an internal chat log so that anybody with access to it could see the ongoing conversation, as long as they had internet anyway. This was still during the days of dial-up. De L'Espinois and the filming crew spent about 6 months traveling to places like Florida, Tasmania, and Argentina to scout and shoot over 70 background plates per day in appropriately cinematic and florally accurate spots, making a big point to avoid areas heavy with grass, which was not as common and widespread during the Mesozoic as it is today. When they returned to their hotels in the evenings, they'd get to work editing all the footage in an offline program that would eventually be brought back to Evergreen Films' Los Angeles studio for further refinement, and then sent to Canada to add the dinosaurs and other visual effects like splashes and dirt clouds. Because there were no practical models, De L'Espinois had to make sure that the film crew had appropriate framing references for each individual shot, resulting in often makeshift, in-the-field examples of now common methods of framing a CGI character within a live-action shot, such as the ever-popular ball-on-stick technique that he used to aim the camera to appropriately capture the height of a passing sauropod. While the film crew was imagining the dinosaurs in the field, the production teams at Evergreen Films and the then-new Canadian animation company Meteor Studios were working to bring the creatures to life. Marc Dubois was the lead creature designer on the project after initially starting on it as a storyboard artist, and worked pretty closely between the different individual visual effects teams and the producers based in Toronto to keep things cohesive. In terms of keeping things together, this wasn't a particularly difficult issue, considering that the studio itself was so new at the time that it was still being constructed, and the team only had about half the space to work in. The dinosaurs were designed in close consultation with a number of notable paleontologists, including Thomas Holtz, Philip Currie, and James Kirkland, who provided a lot of input on the newly discovered creatures for the Mid-Cretaceous segment. There was an effort to give the animals an overall more earthy look, resulting in a lot of browns and grays with subtle patterning and sparing applications of bright colors, partly because the tech resources available actually prevented a lot of potentially bright coloration against the already lush background plates, particularly greens and reds. This does make the dinosaurs look a bit less readily visually distinct, though a few species did get some oft-overlooked iridescence, a coloration feature that hasn't really been used much in on-screen depictions since then. The animators, some of whom had worked on Jurassic Park and Disney's Dinosaur, aims to imbue the creatures with a sense of personality through their movements and posturing to keep them visually engaging, and referenced a variety of modern animals including birds, lizards, and elephants, almost treating them as characters in a way that later programs like Dinosaur Planet and Dinosaur Evolution would continue further to varying degrees of success. Speaking of characters, John Goodman's involvement is its own whole mini-saga. Discovery had already picked the popular actor to narrate the documentary before de L'Espinois was actually hired, which I guess speaks somewhat to the priorities of the company, though it did make a little thematic sense. Goodman had featured in dinosaur-related media before, having played the T-Rex in We're Back, A Dinosaur Story, and Fred Flintstone in the live-action The Flintstones movie. However, at the time, he was just coming off the production of another voice-acting role in a little film called Monsters Incorporated, and was about to spend months rehearsing for a star-studded production of playwright Anton Chekhov's The Seagull in August of 2001. So while he was happy to narrate Discovery's project, his schedule was very tight. You might think, well, it's only a factual narration script. You just have to read the thing once or twice and be done with it, right? Can't have been too bad. Well, this wasn't helped by the already scattered production on Discovery's end. Between this and his own schedule, Goodman ended up coming in multiple times over the course of a few months to complete the different sections of the script, which would be sent to the audio and sound design team. The bulk of the narration work was done during one of the breaks between rehearsals for The Seagull, and was particularly fraught. Goodman had strained his voice during his on-stage activities, so he was already in a bad mood when he arrived at the recording studio. But it was the dinosaur names, and being corrected about how to pronounce them, that really got to him. And I mean, that's fair, scientific names can be hard. Heck, regular words can be hard. Reportedly, he got so frustrated at various points that he threatened to quit, which obviously would have been disastrous with so little time to find a new narrator. Fortunately, he stuck with it, and in the end was pleased with the final product, though if you watch or have watched this show and notice names like Desmatosuchus being pronounced as
Demastasuchus,
or Anatotitan being
Anatotitan,
that's probably because there weren't any pencils left to break, and de L'Espinois and others figured it was just best to leave it be. Being Discovery's first major prehistory documentary, the executives pulled all the stops to raise awareness of the show leading up to its July 15th release, including an early screening in Hollywood on July 7th that was attended by a number of notable actors of the day, including the late Trevor Goddard, Patricia Heaton, and Bryan Cranston? I couldn't find anything about whether these people were specifically invited or just happened to show up out of their own interest in dinosaurs. Maybe it was the after-party at the La Brea Tar Pits and the rock climbing wall, in which case, understandable. By all accounts, the whole thing went well, despite production on the show having continued literally down to the last possible second, by which I mean the production crew was still editing footage and touching up visual effects work on the day of the premiere, and de L'Espinois had to scramble to actually get the finished product across LA to make it in time for the showing, with barely 2 hours to spare. The marketing campaign began shortly thereafter.
Surprising new discoveries, amazing new species. You never know what you'll find in your own backyard. When dinosaurs roamed America. Sunday, July 15th at 8 Eastern and Pacific on the Discovery Channel. Closer than you think.
When Dinosaurs Roamed America ultimately premiered to an audience of about 5 million viewers and was generally well received, though how many of them were lured in by the show itself as opposed to a chance to catch a glimpse of Jurassic Park 3, I don't know, but it might not have been an insignificant number. I actually didn't know this before doing research for this video because my parents didn't record any of the commercials when they taped the show, but as I mentioned earlier, Discovery Channel and Universal Pictures had teamed up to promote the third and arguably most infamous installment of the sci-fi franchise, and When Dinosaurs Roamed America was actually the warm-up act for a whole 3 days of intense media campaigning for Jurassic Park 3, leading up to its own release on July 18th. Dubbed Discovery Channel Goes Jurassic, each night was hosted by actors from the film, and Stan Winston himself, who presented behind-the-scenes featurettes, segments explaining the science relating to the film, and of course those all-important special previews. The channel also aired an encore presentation of the Avery Brooks narrated Walking with Dinosaurs, divided into 3 hour-long segments for each night of the event. I do find it a little disappointing and a bit of a slap in the face to the team behind When Dinosaurs Roamed America. You know, the show Discovery Channel actually made themselves. But at the end of the day, it really makes me appreciate the less grand and hyperbolic nature of this overlooked documentary, even more than I already did from nostalgia alone. And hopefully you can get why I've decided to really delve into it as a whole miniseries on the channel. This show was a foundational part of my childhood and fueled my lifelong love not just for dinosaurs and prehistory in general, but for the natural world as a whole, and understanding our place in it and the ways we can communicate and spread that interest to others. With all that said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll return for the next few installments, where I'll delve into the actual science of When Dinosaurs Roamed America, and see how it holds up with 20 years of paleontological developments and hindsight, followed by a full-length video as I originally intended, featuring extra information and commentary so that it's not redundant. If you happen to know anything more about the topics covered here, please feel free to post them in the comments, and be sure to share your own experiences and memories of the program. I also want to thank both Pierre de L'Espinois and Marc Dubois for providing me with all the background info on the show's production. I'll have full interviews with them uploaded and linked in the description in the next few days for anyone interested in that. So, many thanks, stay safe, and I will see you next time.